Good morning, everybody. It really is a pleasure to be here. The last time I was in Santiago was about 15 years ago as a little backpacker going around South America, and I can assure you that Santiago is well different from 15 years ago. But luckily, the Lomo Completo that I sought out yesterday is still exactly the same. So even though the more things change, some things stay exactly the same, which is very pleasing. So as mentioned, I'm going to speak about incorporating data into the national accounts and GDP more broadly. And so part of this work commenced at the OECD. As mentioned, I'm now assisting with the task force. It's an IMF Eurostat task force that is helping to compile a manual that will assist countries with incorporating data assets into GDP in line with the revision to S&A that's occurring. So this is a pretty easy sell. Data is very important. And right now, there's a data-shaped hole in the national accounts, so to speak. It's somewhat there in databases, it's somewhat there in research and development, it's somewhat there in computer software, but we do think that the national accounts will benefit from having an explicit data asset. Data has become fundamental to not only the creation of new products, such as digital advertising and also AI, which we'll hear about this afternoon, but also, and I think even more important, is that it's become fundamental to businesses' processes. And so that's not just the new digital natives, but also the traditional companies that are using data to come up with or improve just-in-time inventory, or to improve loyalty programs, or even just to come up with better demand forecasts to become more efficient. Data has become fundamental to these businesses. And right now, there's no current data asset in the S&A. So because data has become so important, a lot of people, both statistical officers and academia, have tried to compile estimates to try and come up with the estimates of value of data. And this has been done in a range of ways. So the first here, based on market capitalisation. The most well-known of these are the sort of the FANGs, that we know that the market capitalisation of Facebook and Google far and outweigh significantly larger than the sum of the fixed assets. So we know that there is an additional asset worth value there, and by measuring it via the market capitalisation is one way of trying to put a value to that X asset, which we would think is data. You can also get it from revenue from the sales of data products or data-intensive products. And then finally, another way is through willing to pay or willing to accept surveys, where people will come up with estimates about what they would pay to use social media or to go without social media. And this is a roundabout way of putting a value on data, because essentially what we're putting a value on is not whether or not we can use social media, it's what is the price for us to give the information to the digital platforms. And digital platforms are not going to invest more than what they get in return. And so this is a proxy for the value of data. So that's all useful. And what does it have to do with GDP? Currently, not a lot. As mentioned, there is no explicit data asset in GDP. And if we want to take the theme of the conference, if we want to create information to unlock the future, then we need information on data, and more so, we need information on data that is consistent with the national accounts and GDP. When we look at data, there's a lot of characteristics that make it appear as if it is consistent with assets in the national accounts. It's a result of production. It can be used repeatedly in the production process, and it can be seen as a store of value. So additionally, for all the reasons that I touched on very briefly, as data becomes more important, there is more and more demand for information on data. Not just for productivity, though that's a significant use, but really just to consolidate the trust that users have in the GDP and the national account figures by making sure that those numbers are reflective of the modern economy that we see today. And so we think about a scenario of two banks, both have the same amount of computer software, both have the same amount of employees, the same amount of computer hardware. But one bank spends a large amount of its labour force on data scientists who are tasked with capturing the information being created by delivering the financial services and organising and storing it and making it accessible for use. We then have bank number 2, which does none of that. Now we know that bank number 1 is going to be able to create efficiencies that the other bank cannot. We know that they are going to be able to identify fraudulent transactions, identify sales opportunities. But in the eyes of the national accounts currently, both assets bases for both banks would be exactly the same. So it's evident that there is a asset that needs to be capitalised or expenditure that needs to be capitalised to become an asset within the national accounts. So exactly what kind of data are we talking about? By now, I would hope that everyone has seen the first one of data as the new oil. If you haven't, welcome to the field of statistics. Data is sunshine, with the idea of it being it's an unusual resource in the fact that we use it, but it still keeps regenerating. And then finally, data is water, in the fact that it can be contaminated, it can be stored, but there's also leaks. Now, I'm a national accountant. I'm not a natural wordsmith. I don't have a beautiful description like one of these. So we've gone with a much more technical definition of information content that is produced by accessing and observing phenomena and recording, organising, storing information elements from these phenomena in a digital format which provide an economic benefit used in productive activities. Probably not as sexy as the new oil, but we think for the sake of economic statistics and measuring that this is probably more useful to statistical officers. Now there are 3 points I just want to highlight in this definition. The first is that digital only. Now obviously non-digital data exists. Data has been used in production for centuries. However, we do think that if a caveat is that data needs to actually be used in production, we think that the amount of non-digital data that is actually used in production is relatively trivial. And furthermore, this also provides the opportunity for compilers to come up with an estimate as opposed to trying to compile anything that has ever been written down on a piece of paper. And so that's an important one, but I think relatively straightforward. The next one is the economic benefit caveat. Now, this in itself is not new. In the current S&A, for an asset to be a fixed asset, it needs to provide an economic benefit to its owner. So the idea that people are accumulating data and putting it on the wall and never doing anything with it, well, that technically will not be data within the new S&A because it's not being used in production to create an economic benefit. So this goes hand in hand with the measurement approach, which I'll cover next, in that if a company is going to spend resources to come up with data, chances are that they're going to use it in production. Nobody is just creating data for the sake of it. So again, this seems quite obscure, but it's really just a matter of fact and quite logical. And then the final one is the difference between the produced data asset and the non-produced information elements of the observable phenomena. And this is slightly different from when data was discussed previously prior to the 2008 S&A revision, in that there was concern around capitalising knowledge, and that if we were to capitalise data, then anybody who records something on a computer, their thoughts, their knowledge would be creating GDP or creating value added. We've moved it along slightly, and this is the data information chain from the Going Digital Toolkit note, which is the basis of the presentation today. And here you can see the large first blue box, the dark blue box, is the observable phenomena, and they are everywhere. And they can be produced as an externality of production, or they can be produced naturally. And don't worry, it is on the toolkit note available on the website. So if you can't see all the writing, I encourage you to have a look afterwards. But what we're really seeing here is the step process of once these information from observable phenomena are recorded and stored, then they become data. And it's that recording, organising, cleaning that is the act of production that makes data a produced asset. From there, it then can be organised into a database, another fixed asset currently in the S&A, and then insights can be gleaned from it. And what we're really saying here is that once data is fit for purpose, then the data asset is complete. And if you start using that data to produce other goods and services, well, you're not actually making a data asset anymore. You're using the data asset to produce digital advertising or to produce, well, pretty much everything else in the world these days. So hopefully by here, I've convinced you that A, the S&A needs a data asset explicitly, and B, explained as best I could in the short time that I have exactly the type of data that we want. So we can just go out and do it, right? But as you'll see here, and this is only 4 examples, and I could probably list 10 relatively easily, the data is very different from the other fixed assets that exist in the S&A. So most data is produced on an own account basis. Data doesn't depreciate in a conventional sense. There's obviously obsolescence, but obviously the wear and tear on a digital asset doesn't really exist. Data is extremely heterogeneous, and for this purpose, even if we did have market transactions, I would suggest that it would be very difficult to find market transactions that are representative of all the data out there. Data is extremely heterogeneous, and because of this, we really need to approach it from a different way to how we measure other fixed assets. And quantity is often unrelated to value. We know that you can have miles and miles and gigabytes, terabytes of data that don't mean anything, as opposed to a particularly useful piece of data used in the right context can be particularly valuable. So just to prove a previous point, here's some data from Eurostat for 2020, and it really shows that while a third or a quarter to a third of companies are using big data analytics, the percentage that are actually purchasing the data is very, very small. And the percentage of people that are actually selling data is even smaller again. And so, unlike most other assets in the national accounts, it really is own account production of data that is important. And this makes sense. There's a large amount of academic work that shows about the importance of the proprietary advantage of data. There's not a lot of use in buying data if you know that your competitor across the street has access to the same data. And so because of this, there's good reasons, but here is some very clear proof that data assets are really consumed on an own account basis. So how can we value them then? If we know that market price or market transactions are unlikely, just because there isn't a large amount, net present value is used in the national accounts, often for natural resources. But a lot of the assumptions that are used for net present value are based on the constants that exist, the information that we already know about oil, about gold, about copper. There's a lot about data we don't know and exactly about how value can be derived from it. Now, finally, as well as that, the heterogeneity of data is significantly different to natural resources. An ounce of gold, a barrel of oil is very similar to one created in a year's time, or created in another country. That's not the case with data, so net present value is not necessarily adaptable. So this is where we've landed with sum of cost, is the recommendation that is going forward in the S&A to measure data assets. So when we look at estimating via the sum of cost, we have the labour and other costs involved in production, and some of those I've listed are planning, preparing, accessing and recording, and then cleaning and processing the data. But again, once the data asset is fit for purpose, then the expenditure on a data asset stops and the use of the data asset begins. An important part of the sum of costs is the consumption of fixed capital that needs to feed into it. We know a large amount of data is captured through digital platforms, free digital services that Tina just mentioned. And so the expenditure on these software that is used as a portal to collect information elements needs to be taken into consideration. The consumption of these assets needs to be taken into consideration when deriving the overall cost of the data product. And then we have a markup for market producers, which again is relatively standard for S&A when measuring through sum of costs. Now, pleasingly, this is not a pipe dream or a pie in the sky. We do have examples already of values of data assets. So these have been compiled by several statistical officers, as well as by academia. And I haven't even got them all up here. And what this has really done is the NSOs have taken the what if data was a produced asset. And so they have come up with estimates of essentially an asset that is currently not in the pre-production and the asset boundary, and said, if data was a produced asset, then this is what the value would be. And this is really important because it has confirmed the feasibility of the approach that we are recommending. Now, you'll see here that in terms of the value of the data assets, we range from 0.8 to 2.7. And then, so from a level point of view, it's not trivial, but it's not overpowering either. And then the growth rates, as you would expect, are relatively minor because while data expenditure has grown slightly quicker than overall GDP and capital formation, the difference is quite minor, and it is only making up sort of that 1 to 3%. And so the impact on GDP and GFCF, or capital formation so far, has not seemed to break GDP, so to speak. An important aspect here in the Corrado and others study is that they have data, and then which they've labelled as data stores, and then databases and data intelligence. And this is important because we need to be mindful of double counting, in that some of the expenditure on research and development, on databases, on computer software that is currently in the accounts, likely should be reflected as expenditure on data. And so we need to capture the expenditure that is data, add it to the expenditure that is not being captured, and create an explicit asset. So it's all sorted then. Countries will go out and produce this. Probably not quite so quick. I like to think that if we have the conceptual methodology and we have some practical examples, then this is the end. But as Churchill once said, it's unlikely to be the beginning of the end, but more the end of the beginning. And what I have here is the exact paragraph from the current SNA when it was talking about research and development. And I do feel that that data is in a similar position to research and development when it was incorporated, in the fact that they think that specific guidelines, methodology, practice need to be developed in order to give appropriate levels of confidence in the resulting measures. And by no means have we worked out every component of data measurement. This work will need to continue for the next year, 2 years, and then even after the SNA is officially endorsed. And so already the IOs are working with statistical officers to improve compilation strategies in this. So as some form of summary, we think that the existing work that already exists, there you go, the existing work already validates the implementations being recommended. We think that the exclusion, especially when the SNA is being revised, would have eroded the trust and the relevance of SNA as an indicator of the economy. And so if not now, then when was spoken about in terms of incorporating data, that if there's a revision taking place, let's use this opportunity. Preliminary results shows that it doesn't break GDP, but hopefully will add to the user's ability to understand various components of the economy. And a manual handbook is underway with the IMF and Eurostat. I will finish on just highlighting that this work is part of a broader Going Digital project at the OECD, which is now in its 4th phase. And it covers beyond just measurement of economic statistics, but a large part of it is measurement of economic statistics that are connected with digitalisation. So there's a range of toolkit notes, including the value of data, digital trade. The OECD, with some other IOs, recently released a handbook on measuring digital trade, as well as digital supply use tables and measuring wellbeing. And overall, there is a digital indicator toolkit which provides information on digitalisation for a range of OECD countries. So thank you very much.